As always, I was talking about something else. Okay, we're talking about eyewitnesses who are children. And the question is, are they accurate or inaccurate? It really all depends on their age. The younger they are, the less accurate they tend to be. And the less juries will believe them. Unfortunately. They've done mock trial jury studies, just like they do on, if you've ever watched Bull, he always does a mock trial to try to determine what's going to happen in the trial. But of course they've done studies looking at mock trials, and actually they assume that they're fairly accurate. When they did the mock jury trials, they found that child eyewitnesses are generally viewed as less credible than adult eyewitnesses, and that's logical, I guess. In cases of child sexual abuse, younger victims are viewed as more credible than adolescents or adults, probably because jurors suspect that the younger children lack the sexual knowledge to fabricate an allegation. Okay, when you are an adult or when you are an adolescent, of course, you're having dreams that have sexual content in them. But as a child, of course, you haven't gone through puberty yet, so this is one of the things that isn't taking place. You're not having dreams with sexual content when you're young. So because of that, they assume that anything that they say as far as sex is concerned is fairly accurate, because they don't have sexual ideas and they don't have any sexual ideations whatsoever. I was reading, I was on the internet last night and I was looking at Pollard, of course, and trying to figure out why the hell haven't they brought that lady back yet? She is back. She came back last night. His girlfriend. So maybe we'll figure out what's going on. Well, while I was wandering around, there was a story about Ariel Winter. Ariel Winter is the young Dunphy in Family Matters? Family something. Modern Family. Modern Family. The one with Sofia Vergara in it? Okay. So she's the young one. She was the young girl in the show. And strangely enough, this lady exploded. Some very odd things were taking place with this girl. She had an older sister in the show who was actually smaller than she was. When I say exploded, I'm talking about her chest. Her chest grew just to enormous proportions. So she had to have a breast reduction surgery done. That's not the important thing. What I read last night was that she was sexualized by her mother. And when I say she was sexualized by her mother, what I mean is that she was taught about sex by her mother, not by showing her things, but by dressing her in a sexual manner. Kind of like Jean-Benet Ramsey, where she would, her mother would dress her up like a little tart, like a little prostitute. For her, she was a beauty pageants, yeah, beauty pageants. Okay, but of course Ariel Winter wasn't. She was an actress. She wasn't in these beauty pageants, so she couldn't really separate the way her mother was dressing her up. This is the way I dress when I'm at a beauty pageant. This is the way I dress when I'm at home. It wasn't that kind of a situation. Her mother was actually dressing her up that way at home, so that she could be a more popular actress. She was wearing very short skirts. She was putting makeup on her face, all of these things. And she claims that she was sexualized by her mother. Well, it turns out that Ariel Winter is 19 years old now, and she hasn't communicated with her mother for 5 years. She has been emancipated from her mother for 5 years. Because her mother was fairly intimidating, and she was giving her information or forcing her to act like she was an adult, like she was a sexualized adult. And of course that kind of bothered her a great deal. So what has happened with Ariel Winter? Oh, she just started UCLA in the fall. So she's going to college. Maybe everything will turn out okay. We don't know. She's had breast reduction surgery done. Her breasts were quite large. She had breast reduction surgery done. She's still an actress, and she's still on that television show, but of course she complained that her mother had done that to her. So these kinds of things can possibly happen to little children. Parents can treat their children like adults, and actually sex has something to do with being an adult. So that's what happened with Ariel Winter. Note that jurors can recognize the effects of suggestive questioning, and of course this is something that they saw in the mock trials. So some of these individuals, if they have been sexualized, of course, then it changes everything. It changes the way that people react to them, whether they are accurate or not. Judges allow various courtroom modifications to protect children from potential stress in testifying. The placement of a screen in front of a defendant has been used so that the child witness cannot see him or her while testifying. In other words, they're dealing with a select individual that potentially has molested them or has done something to them, and if they make eye contact with this individual, then it will frighten the child. And for that reason, of course, they try to screen the child from seeing this select individual, because that can intimidate them. It can frighten them for the future. Potentially, if it's their mother, their father, their boyfriend of their mother, potentially in the future, if they lose the case and this person isn't forced to stay away from them, then potentially they will come in contact with this individual in the future. So what they do is, when they testify, they'll put a screen in front of the child. That's one of the ways that they can do it. The other way is by using closed-circuit television. Supreme Court later ruled that the defendant's right to confront his accuser was not outweighed by the necessity of protecting victims of sexual abuse. This happened in 1988. Of course, part of the problem was that the courts said that they have a right to face their accuser, they have a right to look them in the eye, and they were saying that this should be happening with children. That was the defense plea. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, Coy versus Iowa in 1988, and they lost. They lost. So the child does not have to come in contact with this individual. They don't have to see the individual, because potentially they could intimidate them. And of course, we do that with our children. We can control our children just with a look. Isn't that the way we do it? My mother did. She could certainly control me with a look, and of course I knew that it usually meant that, my God, you better look at me, and after you look at me, you better do what you're supposed to do, because if you don't, then something bad is going to happen to you, probably with crying and pain. And pain and crying is going to come next. In the case of Maryland versus Craig in 1990, the court upheld a law permitting a child to give testimony in a different part of the courthouse and have the testimony transmitted to the courtroom via closed-circuit television, or CCTV. The law applied to cases where the child was likely to suffer significant emotional distress by being in the presence of the defendant. Craig thus modified the rule of the Coy case. The Coy case had to do with putting a screen in front of the child so they couldn't make eye contact, so the defendant couldn't see the child, and potentially force the child to adjust their testimony. And of course, this is a case where they actually use closed-circuit television in order to transmit the information to the jury. So Craig, Maryland versus Craig, and Coy versus Iowa, of course, are two very important cases as far as child testimony is concerned. Children give more detailed statements when allowed to testify on closed-circuit television, and children also feel less nervous when allowed to testify outside of the courtroom. Courtrooms are fairly intimidating to everybody, and it's especially intimidating to a child. Unfortunately, children who testify via closed-circuit television are viewed less positively than children who testify in open court, and this is kind of unfortunate. because it's just there to protect the child, unfortunately. You got a seat? Are we okay? All right. Do I have to go steal Johnny's chair? No? Okay. Good. One way to modify the courtroom experience for the child is to provide an advocate who can familiarize the child with the courtroom setting. They can permit a support person to sit with the child during testimony, and of course if you watch this on television, you see that there's always somebody from Child Protective Services with the child if they are giving information to law enforcement or to the courts. There's always somebody from Child Protective Services. Theoretically, this is a professional that will protect the child. Actually, in the state of Iowa, my wife was a CASA volunteer, and I'm trying to think what CASA stands for. Child Advocate. She was a Child Advocate Services Association or something. Anyway, she was a CASA volunteer, and she did this. She would go to court with the child. She would sit by the child. Of course, she knew the child relatively well, and she would accumulate information about the child. But she would also be there with the child when the child was testifying. So that was one of her tasks, was being a child advocate for this select individual. The problem is, of course, if a family is under a court order, usually they have a lawyer. The lawyer defends the family, but the lawyer can, of course, deal with each individual child. So they will assign them a child advocate, and that child advocate will make sure that nothing happens to that child. In other words, the child's rights are not impinged by the rest of the family or by the courts, and that is her job. That's my wife's job. It's a voluntary thing. She's a CASA volunteer. What else do we do? We make structural changes to the courtrooms to allow the child to testify. Usually they testify from a dais, so it's raised. So potentially what you can do is have them testify on the ground floor rather than in a raised situation. Emotionally motivated forgetting is called repression. The forgotten events are thought to be so traumatizing that individuals bury them deeply in their unconscious. These repressed memories sometimes stay forgotten unless and until they are spontaneously recalled by exposure to some aspect of the original experience. We repressed ideas. Do you believe this? This is a Freudian concept. Some people hate Freud. No matter what he said, it's all wrong. Okay. So do you believe in repressing thoughts? Is it possible that people have gone through something so traumatic that they have tried to forget it to the extent that they can't remember it? Is that possible? Do you remember every damn thing that ever happened to you? Is it all in there someplace? Actually, this information is in there as well, but we're putting blocks in front of it, so we can't remember it. You guys believe that or not? There's some people that don't believe in repression. They won't even talk about it. They're psychologists, and they won't talk about repression. I know. Who are these people? They're cognitive psychologists. They're so much fun. Anyway, okay, do you guys believe this or not? How many people believe it? Raise your hand if you believe it. Okay. How many people don't believe it? It's not possible to forget something. Okay. I have the ability to do this. This is kind of cool. I know, it's great. So I go through something bad, like all the divorces I've been through, and I can't remember half the shit that happened. I mean, it's that way. That's kind of cool, isn't it? Yeah, so I'm a pretty happy guy, and maybe some really horrible things have happened to me in the past, but I don't remember them. I just kind of shove it back there and take some cement, bury it, you know, put it in a casket and bury it. I encapsulate things. I'm really good at that. Okay, not bad. Some suggest that repression has never been proven to exist and that the inability to remember traumatic events can be explained by ordinary forgetting. So they don't believe it exists. There are psychologists out there that argue against it. There are lawyers out there that will argue this in court. Repression doesn't exist. How can you repress an idea? Why did it come forward now? What happened? Why in the world did it come forward? And of course, this is part of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes something will trigger that information, and then it will come forward. But hopefully it will come forward in a non-threatening situation. So if you're in combat and something horrible happens to you in combat, right afterwards you're traumatized to some extent. But if you can forget it, now you can go out and do it again. Put yourself in harm's way again. As stupid as that sounds, you can do it again because you've repressed it. Now, this is what happened to me. So I was working at a hospital, and they had a life. It was late at night, or it was early in the morning actually. I went in like at 4 o'clock in the morning to draw blood from the kids. I was working at a children's hospital. So I was going to work, and there was a life flight that was taking off. And of course, life flight's a helicopter. So I was walking into the building, and the rotors, the air from the rotors, hit me. And I started having a flashback. That wasn't the worst part. I worked on the 6th floor, so I had to get in the elevator and go up. And when I got in the elevator and went up, all of a sudden I had this, it got worse. Yeah, because that's the way it feels like when you're in a helicopter. It's like being in an elevator that goes up really fast. That's the way it feels. Anyway, got into the elevator, started to go up, and of course, I'm freaking out. all of these memories came flooding back. I'm going, oh, where did this come from? Anyway, they were repressed ideas. And of course, the helicopter. I hate helicopters to this day. You hear them, and actually in Iowa they fly over all the time. So every time I hear one, I hide. So this is what happens in helicopters. This is what happened in Vietnam. In Vietnam, of course, there was a lot of vegetation, so they really couldn't see you very well. So a helicopter or a gunship would fly over. This is horrible. A gunship would fly over, and if they saw something moving, they would shoot at it. As stupid as that sounds, theoretically they knew where you were supposed to be. And of course, we were wearing different clothes than the other guys were. Damn it. Even the North Vietnamese were wearing brown uniforms, and we had green uniforms on. Anyway, so sometimes they'd shoot at you. So helicopters are really kind of scary. They were scary to me anyway, okay? Because I got shot at a couple of times. And even if they're far away, they can drop rounds in on top of you. Just like what happened in, just like what happened in Las Vegas. He was just dropping rounds in on people. That's ugly. Okay, so we're talking about repression. Some people don't believe in repression. I do, because I do repress things, bad things. I told you, and I try to laugh about it, right? I tried to laugh about my wife stabbing me in the chest. That's so funny. Brad's just getting a giggle out of that. Yeah, but for the longest time I hadn't remembered that. I've got scars on my arm where my wife stabbed me earlier in the day, and I had forgotten about that until I saw the scar, until I realized the scars. That's what the scars were all about. A related unconscious process is known as dissociation. I repress thoughts. I don't dissociate from things. I don't see myself as separate from the individual that is suffering that trauma. But some people do. They dissociate. This is a good way to, if something horrible is happening to you, then you don't feel like the person that it's happening to. You feel like somebody else. You take yourself out of your own body, and this is known as dissociation. Individuals who have been traumatized a great deal, like they've been sexually molested over and over and over again. A lot of times these individuals, in order to suffer from the same trauma over and over and over again, they will take themselves out of their own bodies. They will create a new personality. And this is known as dissociative identity disorder, where they create a new personality. So that while they're being molested, they ain't the person that they normally are. There's somebody else. And then they can take that personality and they can shove it off into a corner someplace. So if they suffer from, if they suffer one of these traumas, they can just pretend that they're not the same person. I say pretend, but the reality is their whole personality will change. They're not the same person they were before. Sometimes they're not the same gender that they were before. If they are a female, sometimes they will have a personality that is a male personality. Why would they have a male personality? To deal with trauma.
Like a protector?
Exactly. Exactly. So while they are being traumatized, at the same time, this is the personality that's allowed to be angry, that's allowed to strike out. They will also create a personality that is a young person. A young person, sometimes they're pre-linguistic, but usually they can talk. So why would they create a personality that is a child? Younger than the individual that's being molested.
Remember, like, to protect themselves, like, not remember what happened beforehand, kind of?
Exactly, innocence. So they can go back to a time of innocence. So when they are in this personality, they're not only innocent, but they're also pre-linguistic. And it allows them to grieve without actually grieving. Because babies cry all the time, don't they? Okay. Does all this make sense?
Yeah.
You believe this? You believe this crap? Well, there's a lot of individuals that don't believe in dissociative identity disorder. They don't believe in repression. They don't believe any of this stuff because it's Freudian. And of course, Freud was full of bananas. Or worse. Something that smells worse than bananas. What could that possibly be? Anyway, they try to detach themselves by creating other personalities. If you've never seen this, then it's really hard to understand. But if you've ever seen this, you go, wow, yeah, that's... Their facial expressions will change. Their voices will change. Sometimes their prescription for their eyes will change. So, normally they need glasses. All of a sudden they'll take off their glasses. They don't need them anymore.
There was this movie that they just made. It's called Split.
Yeah.
Did you see it?
No, I didn't see it, but I understand it's about this.
Yeah, and in that, one of his personalities, he had diabetes.
Oh, okay.
But not with the other ones.
Right.
And then he did have a man who was a protector, a child that was innocent. He had a
Mother figure.
Oh yeah, a mother figure.
Oh, wow.
He had a gay personality. He had just all these personalities, and then he had the monster. The monster was the last one that came out, and he was actually like a cannibal when that one came out. And then he was trying to kill himself at the end because he finally, what was it, 3 years after? 3 years of all these split personalities and not him himself came out. Can you see it?
Sounds like fun.
Yeah.
There was an individual in Ohio who got caught. He was grabbing women and he was forcing them to take all their money out of the ATM. Then he was taking them off and raping them. And this happened 2 or 3 times before finally he called the police up on the telephone and told them that he was the one that had done it. Well, as it turned out, he had dissociative identity disorder. And he turned himself in, but it wasn't his normal personality that turned himself in. It was this little kid that was a very moralistic individual. So when this personality came out, he dropped a dime on himself. So it was just the most bizarre thing in the world. But as it turned out, he had several different personalities. The one that was robbing the women was a personality that had also joined the Navy, and he got into all kinds of interesting problems in the Navy. So that was the personality that was robbing the women. The personality that was raping the women wasn't the same personality. It was a lesbian personality. He had a lesbian personality inside him, and she was very sexually aggressive. And because of it, she was the one that was raping the women, as confusing as that is. He also had a personality that could pick locks. So they kept putting him in a straitjacket because he would go berserk. You know, the 14-year-old, this crazy 14-year-old personality would go crazy in his cell, so they put him in a straitjacket. And then the other personality would come out and pick the lock on the straitjacket, and he would be, you know, he could get out of it in a matter of minutes, as bizarre as all that sounds. This individual eventually committed suicide. He was acquitted because of, for reasons of insanity, and he could never live a normal life. Once he had disclosed all these personalities, of course, he had to live with himself, and he couldn't do that. He eventually committed suicide, which is a sad, sad part of the story. I apologize for the sad part of the story. But all of his different personalities did different things. One robbed people, one raped people, one was the moral part of his personality, and that's the one that turned him in. Most of the reports of repressed and recovered memories involve claims of child sexual abuse. The theory is that individuals suffered sexual or physical abuse as children, often at the hands of a trusted adult. And normally that trusted adult is a parent. Maybe it's a step-parent. Actually, more biological parents are abusers of their children than anybody else. This is a point of fact. We like to think it's the wicked stepmother or that evil boyfriend of their mothers, but the reality is that it's usually a biological parent. Repressed or dissociated any memory of these horrors for many years. Of course, this individual repressed or dissociated the memories. They recovered their memories of the abuse when it was psychologically safe to do so. In other words, they remembered this stuff. Remember, I had the memory of the helicopter when I was in Omaha, and I was perfectly safe. So it was safe for me to remember at that point that the trauma of what happened to me in flying in a helicopter or being around a helicopter. It was safe. No one, there was no machine gun in the helicopter. I didn't have to worry about that. It was a medical helicopter. They don't carry guns. I was okay. Door gunners are so stupid. They'll shoot at anything. Anything that moves, it's one of those kind of situations. Sometimes repressed memories are recovered only after a person participates in psychotherapy that applies techniques such as hypnosis, age regression, guided visualization, diary writing, or therapist instructions to help the client to remember. And of course, one of the techniques is if somebody has a select problem, especially a sexual problem, a lot of times it goes back to their childhood. So we will take them back to their childhood, trying to find out what the trigger is that has caused all these problems. And sometimes we, of course, delve into repressed memories. But we need to figure out what the problem is. We need to figure out why they're having these problems. So we do these things. We use hypnosis, we use age regression, guided visualization, diary writing, or just instructions from the therapist. Once upon a time, my wife was stationed in Korea, Kunsan, Korea, which is actually farther south than Seoul, but it's one of the primary military bases in Korea. It's not the peninsula of Korea is not very large. It's really not very big. So North Korea and South Korea are really close to each other. I mean, there's a demilitarized zone, but Seoul is only like 50 kilometers from the DMZ. It's not very far away. If North Korea decided to invade Korea, they take Seoul in a matter of hours. I mean, it's that close. It's really that close. Okay, so my wife was stationed in Kunsan, and I've told you this, maybe I've told you this story before. There was a lady that she worked with. She was the head nurse. She was an older lady, well, older, I say older, for military people, that's in their 40s. She was in her early 40s, and she had just gotten married to a pilot. And of course, Kunsan is an isolated tour because it's a combat tour. They're right there close to the DMZ. So her husband had just retired from the military, and he was back in the States, and she was in Kunsan. And she had just gotten married to this guy. Madly in love with her sexy pilot husband. But she had just gotten married to him like 2 years before, and here she was, she had an isolated tour in Kunsan. So she was lonely, and she was, can I use the word horny? Okay. She was a little horny, okay. She only got married 2 years before. So yeah, she was just a little bit horny. Okay. I can't think of another word to use. Okay.
Aroused.
Okay, so the problem is, as an officer, they would go to the officers' club to eat. And of course, this is a combat base, and it's a pilot, they had airframes on the base, so they had a lot of pilots at the officers' club. And of course, pilots, I don't know if you've ever seen a pilot, an Air Force pilot, they don't wear very many clothes. Okay, what they do is they have a jumpsuit that they wear. So it's relatively tight because they have to put on, you know, other things on top of it. So it's like wearing spandex, but it's not quite that tight. So here's all these pilots running around in what we refer to as pickle suits because they call her pickles. Okay. But anyway, so here are these guys running around with their jumpsuits on. And of course it shows their butts, and you know how women like to look at men's butts. Anyway, so all these pilots, and they're cute little guys, of course, they're in their 20s and 30s, and they're relatively attractive men because they're pilots, and they've got this ego going and whatnot. So the first time she went over there, she scared herself because she started drinking and she started flirting with some of the pilots. So she scared herself. And she asked my wife, who was there with her, and isn't attracted to men in pickle suits, she told me anyway. She asked her to take her back to the dormitory. So she took her back to the dormitory, and she said, "I'm not going to the officers' club again because all of this stuff happened." And she just dumped all this stuff on my wife. And of course, my wife was going, "Oh God," she didn't want to hear it. So the next day, the lady comes up to her and she said, that night she told her she's never going back to the officers' club again. She's just going to eat in her room. So the next day she comes up to my wife and she says, "Let's go to the officers' club." And my wife reminds her about what she said, and she says, "No, I didn't. I didn't say that. That's the only place to eat on base." So they go to the officers' club again. And as soon as she's the head nurse, and she's got this deep voice, and she tells people what to do, and she's very officious, and she's telling people what to do. And all of a sudden, she gets into the officers' club, and all of a sudden, her voice gets really silly, and she starts giggling, and she comes up to a guy, and she says, "Give me a quarter so I can play some music on the jukebox." And she's just so silly, and she's walking around, and men are offering her drinks, and she's just kind of giggling and drinking Coca-Cola because, she doesn't want to drink alcohol, will make her silly. And she's sitting on guys' laps, and she's putting her arms around their shoulders, and she's asking them for quarters so that she can go and play the jukebox again. What she had done, she had gone back in time. She had regressed. And she'd gone back to the time when she was a cheerleader, and she was acting very sexy, but it was all very innocent. So she had gone back to a time when she was innocent. So while she was in the officers' club, she regressed to an individual that was from a different era, and her brain had gone back to a time when she was an innocent cheerleader, and she was flirting with all the boys, all the men. And of course, they had no clue what was going on. They thought that she was flirting with them, but the reality is, of course, that she was a teenager. In her mind, she was a teenager. And so she was able to keep them from herself from feeling like she wanted to seduce these men by regressing back in time. And that's what she did. Her voice changed. Her demeanor changed. Everything changed. And it drove my wife crazy. Because, you know, my wife, if some guy comes up and flirts with her, she just punches him in the face and tells him to go suck an egg or something. Anyway, but so my wife didn't have to regress. But this lady, in order to control her sexuality, had to regress back in time. It was really fascinating, because then she would, as soon as she stepped out the door, all of a sudden her voice got deeper again. She was serious about everything. She certainly wasn't giggling like she was in the officer's club. One step inside the door, and all of a sudden she's a giggly little teenager again. Just the most bizarre thing in the world. And this went on for like 7 months. It went on for 7 months, and then she found out that her husband was having an affair with somebody back in the States. All bets were off after that. Everything changed. It was so bizarre. Anyway, okay. So age regression is real, and people will do this in order to protect themselves, in order to control themselves. And that's what she was doing. She was doing it in order to protect herself. Given the right set of circumstances, people can create memories of incidents that never occurred. We can implant memories in your mind that do not exist. It's not that hard. All we have to do is make a suggestion. That's what hypnosis is. All we're doing is making a suggestion. Under hypnosis, people will not do anything that they wouldn't do if they were not hypnotized. You can't make somebody pick up a gun and shoot somebody unless they would do it otherwise. It isn't going to happen. It's just a suggestion. And of course, we have suggestions in our minds all the time. I'm really upset with the president. I wish you'd go suck an egg or something. Okay. It's just a suggestion. I'm not going to go up to Donald Trump and shove an egg in his mouth. I'm not going to do that. Probably. Psychologists have been able to implant false memories by enlisting the help of family members who suggest to adult research participants that these relatives recall a fabricated event. So if we can get family members to tell them that this is what happened, we can get them to remember things that didn't actually happen. We can ask participants to imagine events that never occurred. We can doctor family photographs. And we already know how many people believed half of the crap that was on the internet about Hillary Clinton in the last election. There was a lot of fabricated stuff. There was a lot of Photoshopped stuff that people claimed was real. You do remember about the guy that went in and attacked the pizza parlor in New York City because he, on the internet, it came from somewhere, they said that Bill and Hillary were, they were kidnapping children and they were shipping them out of the country to have sex with them from this pizza parlor. And this guy was going to go in there and he's going to break up that sex trafficking ring that Bill and Hillary were running in a pizza parlor in New York City.
Chuck E. Cheese?
No, but it ruined these guys' business. I mean, it was just fabricated. And they had pictures that weren't real, of course. They were all Photoshopped, you know, all of this stuff. And not only that, but they were saying that Bill was flying off to some island in the Philippines and having sex with children. And I mean, it was so bizarre. But people believed this stuff. It was completely fabricated. We may find out that it came from the Russians. Who knows? They were putting all kinds of crap on Facebook, as bizarre as that seems. But you can do this. You can implant false memories in people. And they will claim that it's absolutely true. This really happened. Merely imagining or viewing a photo associated with a fabricated event can dramatically increase the rate of false memories, even when the event is completely implausible. You've seen the picture of the man holding the giant grasshopper that he just shot. You've seen that picture. Or maybe you haven't. Okay. People believe that's really true. You know what a jackalope is? It's a jackrabbit with horns. Is it real? I've seen pictures. Do they really exist? Well, no, they don't really exist. Of course they don't. It's Photoshop. But that's close enough, isn't it? As long as you can see a picture of it. Why? The act of imagining may make the event seem more familiar, but the familiarity is mistakenly related to childhood memories rather than to the act of imagination itself. The reality is that we're trying to remember what happened to us in the past. If I asked you about when you were in the first grade, how much of that information can you remember? How often did things happen to you in the first grade that impacted you so much that you remember it to this day? I mean, you went to school for what, 9 months in the first grade? And how much of those 9 months can you remember? Maybe you wet your pants and you remember that you wet your pants. I remember one day I went to school and the boys were standing at the bottom of the slide watching the girls slide down so that they could see their underwear. And the boys were laughing about it. And the girls were mad, so they stopped sliding on the slide. Except for Alice Peters. Alice took her underwear off, and so then she just went up and down the slide because the boys couldn't see her underwear. And we didn't see her underwear at all. Or they didn't see her underwear. I wasn't down at the bottom of the slide watching. But I remember that happening because I was at the other end of the slide watching people go up. And there was a lot of going up the slide. Of course, I'm 5 years old, so what does that mean? Should I be, am I a sexual predator because I was only 5. Unfortunately, without corroboration, it is very hard to know which distant memories are true and which are implanted via suggestion. One of the things that happened to me when I was in the military is I fell on my head. I fell a really long way and I fell on my head. And a lot of things that happened to me I don't remember. People tell me what happened, and then I try to remember it, and it's just not in there anywhere. I can't find it. I'm not exactly sure it happened. But luckily, this was at the beginning of I was in for 12 years. It was like my first year I was in the service. So I remember everything else, but I just don't remember like right around that time when I fell on my head. Now you understand why I act the way I do. I fell on my head when I was dropped out of a helicopter. It wasn't that high. It was only 30 feet up. I should be dead. That's what they kept telling me. I hate it when they say that. You should be dead. You should be dead. I landed on my shoulders and then I hit my head. But luckily it was on something soft, so I didn't really do that much damage. But even if you fall on a mattress, you can make that mattress go all the way to the ground. Yeah, the impact does. Well, that's what happened. I fell on a bunch of grass. And I did hit my head, and it knocked me out. And it knocked me out for, I don't know, 4 or 5 days, I guess. I told you the story. I was flying with this one air crew, and the guy saved my life. I told you the story. He saved my life. Well, I fell out of the helicopter. We were taking fire, and I fell out of the helicopter, and the guy came, and the door gunner made the pilot come back and get me, because they were under fire, and he was just going to take off. And I had fallen out. Actually, the door gunner knocked me out of the helicopter. So he turns the gun on the pilot, and he says, "You will go back and pick him up." And he did. So he came back and picked me up. And I was dead. And when he picked me up, I was only weighed like 110 pounds. He picked me up by my straps, and he threw me back in the helicopter. When I hit the ground, it shocked me back into coming back alive. But of course I was unconscious, so I don't remember any of this stuff. I just remember the story that they told me afterwards. The air crew was shot down 2 days later and died. I wasn't flying because I was unconscious at the time, but they all died. So I can't corroborate any of these stories, but I was just told the story later. I mean, I was unconscious. I couldn't remember anything. I told you that story. So there's something wrong. Obviously, there's something wrong. Accusations that arise from recovered memories sometimes result in litigation, although note that at times prosecutors have decided not to pursue cases based solely on repressed memories because of the high burden for admissibility of testimony based on repressed memories. Is this true or is this not true? These kinds of situations happen all the time. Individuals remember that, or they have repressed memories that come back. I was molested by my grandfather. I was molested by my uncles. Is this good memory? There are no witnesses, except for the uncle, the grandfather, and the child, of course. And the child has repressed this information, and now this information has come out. So are those memories accurate? And of course, as a defense attorney, you can attack these and have this evidence thrown out of court. It all depends on the judge. It all depends on how he feels about repressed memories. Some accusers have retracted their claims of repressed memories for abuse, and this happens in families. It breaks up families, so instead of prosecuting, they will not testify. They will not testify later on because they were children at the time. And this can destroy a family. It can drive people away from their grandparents. It can drive people away from their uncles and their aunts or whatever. And of course, that's a serious situation. Parents have sued therapists who used memory recovery techniques to help their adult children recover supposedly repressed memories of child sexual abuse. Did it really happen? Now, we're bringing memories back, but are these memories accurate? Children have dreams, especially when they start going through puberty. They start having erotic dreams. They may have erotic dreams about somebody that's real, not a cartoon character or whatever. That's a possibility as well. So how in the world can you prosecute this? Well, you can, and it has been done. But it destroys families. Maybe they remembered their grandfather. Maybe they saw their... Oh, what was I watching the other day? It was a strange new television show about a guy that lost all of his money to his divorced wife, and now he's moved in with his parents, and his brother lives across the hall or something. So now he can't, every time he gets around his parents, he has to interact with JK47 or something, I don't know. Anyway, it's about a guy that moved in with his parents, and his father runs around without his pants on all the time. So he's got his leg up like this, and of course you can't see anything. He's got his leg up like this, and he says, "Look at this rash over here on my leg." And he asks his daughter-in-law to look at this, and she says, "I can't see the rash from your testicles because your testicles are hanging down." Okay, so potentially, this is on television, of course. But so potentially, they saw something that potentially they shouldn't have seen, and of course it becomes a dream that the testicles or somebody's penis or something, or somebody's breast or something, and they have created this memory of something happening. But the reality is they just saw something and it became a dream, and now they're remembering this erotic dream rather than an actual memory. The claims that these malpractice lawsuits usually take the following form. Of course, usually they say that the abuse never occurred. There's no proof that the abuse occurred. All we have is this repressed memory testimony. Therapists created and implanted false memories of abuse through their use of memory retrieval techniques. I've told you that my wife worked at women's shelters, and she worked at women's shelters in Oklahoma, she worked at a women's shelter in Mississippi, she worked in a women's shelter in Washington, D.C., she worked in a women's shelter down in Texas. It's one of the things that she did in her off time, as she had nothing else to do as a colonel in the United States Air Force, so she worked at a women's shelter. When she was going through training in Mississippi, Of course, she had to go through the same training over and over and over again. One of the things they told her is everybody has repressed memories, and everybody, potentially everybody was sexually abused. And of course, my wife has no memory of anything horrible happening to her as a child. But they tried to tell her that everybody has been sexually molested. And she's going, no, no. But the reality is, you know, sometimes people try to implant this idea in people that everybody has been sexually molested. And of course, then they went around the room and asked people to give their story, because of course they were going to hear all these horrible stories when they were working at the women's shelter of sexual abuse and physical abuse and whatnot. And they wanted to hear everybody's story so they would get used to talking about these kinds of things, or at least listening to these kinds of things. And my wife didn't have a story. And of course they're going, come on, honey, now I know everybody's got a story. Come on, you can tell us one. And no, she didn't have a story to tell. But they kept goading her to come up with a story about being abused as a child. And she had no story. But they wouldn't leave her alone. They kept trying to get her to tell them something about what happened in the past. And she wouldn't do it, of course. She's kind of bullheaded that way. You know, she's not going to make something up just because they want to hear something. But the reality is some therapists just don't believe that. One of the things that happened to me when I was up on Fort Belknap was that I was talking to a therapist, and she said, you know, 100% of the women here have been sexually molested. I'm going, really? That's a lot. That's like everybody. And she said, oh yeah, yeah. Well, that's not true at all. It wasn't true. What was true was that was her specialty. And so those were the only stories that she heard. And since 100% of all the stories that she heard were about being sexually molested, especially child sexual molestation, she assumed that it was true for everybody. But the reality was, of course, that's not true at all. It was just, those are the only stories that she heard. And of course, this is part of the problem of being a police officer or being a therapist or working in the emergency room. You get to see people in a traumatic situation. Policemen don't get called out to go to people's parties. They get called out to break up people's parties. So as far as they're concerned, they're supposed to stop prostitution. They're supposed to stop crimes. They're supposed to stop drug abuse. They're supposed to stop people pushing drugs. That's their job. So all the people that they see are fairly bad people. You don't stop somebody for speeding that normally drives the right speed. And normally they try to get out of it by arguing with you. So as far as they're concerned, you know, everybody's a bad guy, because that's all they see are bad guys. It's the same way with this counselor friend of mine. That was her specialty, was women that had been sexually abused. So she assumed everybody had been sexually abused. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. I know, it's ugly. Working in the emergency room, oh my God, everybody's hurt. I got so tired of sick people. My God, they're all sick. Everybody's got the flu. What's going on? Everybody's been beat up. Everybody's been stabbed. My goodness gracious. We had 28 people that got shot in one day. Nobody was killed. Well, 2 people were killed, but we got them in the morgue. We didn't get them in the emergency room. We had 28, and half of these things didn't have anything to do with the others. It was just today's the day that people pull the trigger on somebody else. Anyway, okay. What are we talking about? Clients ultimately came to believe the false memories and accused the alleged abuser, and of course this is a problem that we were talking about before. Okay. Okay. That's the end of chapter 5. I know I'm behind. Whose fault is it? Sheldon's fault. Thank you, Sheldon, for taking responsibility. You monster. Why do you do these things to me? Okay, what are we going to talk about? What time is it? How am I doing?
2 minutes.
Oh, I can do it. Okay.
You can finish the chapter.
I finished chapter 5. Let's start on chapter 6. I know this is the 7th week and I'm behind, okay? But like I said, it's Sheldon's fault. Keeps bothering me back there. He slows me down. Chapter 6 is about the victims of crime and violence. So we talked about the criminals, we talked about the police department, now we're going to talk about the victims. While most feel sympathy toward victims who have experienced crime and or violence, sometimes we blame the victims for their plight. Can we blame the victims of the shooting in Las Vegas? If they hadn't gone to that damn concert, they would be alive today. Is it their fault? They were at the wrong place at the wrong time. Does that make it their fault? We don't. Well, sometimes.
So it's a crime to have a favorite country singer?
Oh, it is. It is a crime. You got it, okay. That's Tiffany's idea. You guys can spread that. It was Tiffany's idea that it's a crime to have the wrong person as a country and western singer. A favorite country and western singer. One reason for this is the need to believe in a just world. We need to believe that the world is a just place. I was reading normally I don't read opinion pieces because I have my own damn opinion. Damn it, I don't have to read anybody else's opinion. Anyway, they were saying, why do we let white guys get away with this? That was what it said. Why do we let white guys get away with this? And they had, of the 9 worst shootings in the United States, only one of the people were not white. And that was that Asian guy that shot up Virginia Tech. The rest of them were white. Why do we let white guys get away with this rage, this angry rage? Of the 40 worst shootings in the United States, 39 were men and 1 was a woman. Of the 9 worst shootings in the United States, only 1 was not white. Why do we let these guys get away with it? You remember the guy, I showed you the video of the guy shooting into the crowd at Charlottesville. He not only had to shoot, he not only shot into the crowd. It's not like, boom, that's not what happened. He had to cock his gun and shoot into it. He tried to pull the trigger once and his gun wasn't cocked, so he cocked his gun and then shot into the crowd. Some crazy white guy. Should we identify him as a crazy white guy? He does seem like he's crazy, doesn't he?
He wasn't talking to anyone.
I'm sorry?
He wasn't talking to anyone.
He wasn't shooting at anybody in particular. He was just blowing.
He was just yelling.
Yeah, yeah. He called them a nigger, if I remember correctly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And all the people he was talking to were white, which is kind of bizarre. You know. Maybe he likes rap, so he hears the word a lot, so he uses it a lot. Maybe that's okay. I don't know. Just world phenomenon. This is known as the just world phenomenon. In other words, we have to rationalize the fact that we can go outside without being shot. I have to think, well, I can go to the gas station for a hamburger at lunch without somebody blowing me away. I have to think about that. Otherwise, I won't get go get my hamburger, right? So otherwise, I'm a scared person. So we need to justify what's going on, and this is known as a just world phenomenon. So why do we let white people get away with this stuff? What's going to happen to Paul? Well, Pollard's dead. He's the 59th person that he killed. He shot himself. And we've heard that story over and over again. The SWAT team broke in and they found him dead. But he had fired through the door at the SWAT team trying to keep them away. And then he shot himself. So he did kill himself. He committed suicide. So the question is, why in the world did he shoot at those people at the country and western thing? Maybe he doesn't like country and western music. He's a gambler and a millionaire. So what the hell was he thinking about? He's got a Filipino girlfriend. He sent her $100,000.
He was just bored with his life.
I'm sorry?
Maybe he was just bored with his life and tried something different.
I don't know. We got to figure this out, though, don't we? I mean, we need to justify what happened. We need to understand what happened so that we can go out the door, so that we can go home tonight, so that we're not afraid to go to the gas station around here. That's all.
For another concert?
Or drive down, or go to a concert. Yeah. Wait. Not a country and western concert. Never a country.
No more aces.
We have to be able to get up and go outside tomorrow morning.
Or even the casino.
There's something about casinos.
That's how we identify.
That's where he met his wife, or his girlfriend, at a casino. She was working at a casino in Reno, and that's where he met her. I read all this morning. I'm still trying to rationalize it myself. As a psychologist, I want to know why he pulled the trigger on 500 and 600 people, well, thousands of people down there. But he actually hits 600 people, almost 600 people. That's a pretty good shoot. But then again, as I said before, he's just dropping rounds into that area. 300 yards is an awful long way. When generally, but he had scoped rifles, and that's what they were afraid of, that he was targeting specific people. So he's shooting specific people. Generally, when considering, yeah, I guess he killed a lady from Gallup. Yeah. Generally, when considering someone else's actions, we use dispositional attributions that focus on the person's ability, level, personality, or even temporary states, such as fatigue, as explanations for the conduct in question. Am I losing my ability to speak? I'm tired. I'm really tired today. And I've been mumbling over some of my words, and I'm not reading very well. But I'm teaching 34 hours this semester. That's the only damn excuse I can think of. I'm tired. Is Sarah as tired as I am? She's got extra classes too. Yesterday she went home early so that she could grade. They haven't graded this week yet. My God, how horrible is that? If people are responsible for their own suffering, we feel less obligated to help them. Are people responsible for their own suffering? Should we feel sorry for these people? What if you see hundreds of these people coming in every day that you have to deal with? Some of them are real and some of them aren't.
You become callous, don't you?
You become callous, of course you do. Of course you become callous. You have to. It's the only way to handle this situation, is to become callous. To make jokes about it. Well, not that many jokes. We blame the victim for their situation. Why did you put yourself in this situation? That's really tough if you're working at a women's shelter. Not to blame the women for what is going on. Because they come in over and over and over and over and over again. It takes an average of 6 times going to the women's shelter before they will actually separate themselves from this man that loves them so desperately. So desperately that he beats the crap out of them. So we blame the victim. And it makes it easier for us. It's just the way it works. 2008, approximately 21 million criminal victimizations occurred. 16 million involved property crimes and 5 million were crimes of violence. 2008, 21 million criminal victimizations happened. That's a lot. In October 1998, 2 powerfully built men lured slightly built gay Matthew Shepard into their truck. They took him up into the mountains and beat him to death because of his sexual orientation. And these are the 2 men, and this is Matthew Shepard. He died 2 days later, if I'm not mistaken. This was in Wyoming. They tied him to a fence and left him to die. And actually, he died of his beating, but he actually died of exposure, because they didn't find him until much later. And it's cold up in Wyoming, if you've never been there, and that's what he actually died from. Legislators, but of course, they convicted the 2 individuals for doing what they did, beating him and leaving him to die. And they were both convicted. Legislators have been increasingly concerned about the proliferation of hate crimes in the United States, and it seems to be getting worse. And this is one of the reasons why we need to know what was Pollard's motivation. Does he hate country and western music? Does he hate other white people? Was he part of ISIS? I mean, that was one of the things that we're talking about right now. We've got to figure out why he did this. So it's the hate crime, the whole concept of hate crime. The guy that fired into the group in Charlottesville, he was part of a neo-Nazi group. And he fired into people that were, what did Trump call them? Antifa. Antifa? Is that what he calls them? Yeah, what's the FA?
Fascist.
Fascist, anti-fascist, that's right, yeah, anti-fascist. That's the first time I'd ever heard it. Trump uses this term. Where the hell did it come from? Where did Antifa come from? Why in the world would Donald Trump use that term? And it's the first time we've ever seen it in the news. Antifa. Anti-fascist. Where's it come from? Where did he get it?
I don't know, but it sounds like soup.
Soup?
Yeah. Like Chinese soup or something.
Let's go down to the Golden Dragon.
Give me something.
Okay. I can tell you where he got it. He got it off of conservative news sites. They talk about it all the time. Of course, I never watch these things. I never read conservative, hyper-conservative, ultra-right conservative stuff, so I don't know about these things. Okay. Hate crimes. Criminal acts intended to harm or intimidate people because of their race, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their religion, or other minority group status. The federal government in 45 states have enacted laws that allow stiffer sentencing for defendants convicted of hate crimes. This can destroy a country. Hate crimes. That's what was going on in Germany. Of course, they're fascist. Okay, I have the 5 states. Anybody want to guess what they are? The 5 states that do not recognize hate crimes. I looked it up before I came to class today. Anybody want to guess as to what those 5 states are?
Arizona.
Arizona is not one of them.
New Mexico.
New Mexico is not one of them.
Colorado.
Colorado is not one of them. Maryland is not one of them.
Florida.
Florida is not one of them.
Is one of them Texas?
No.
Oh, okay. Utah or Vermont?
No. Vermont. Indiana is one of them. Indiana just had a huge controversy about hate crimes. They tried to pass a law, and it was vetoed by the governor. And the governor, of course, at the time was Michael Pence. He's the one that vetoed the hate crimes law. So Indiana's one of them.
Minnesota?
Why would...
I don't know.
Minnesota's like the most liberal place in the United States. Vermont has white people in it, period. That's it. It's like 99% white.
Alabama.
Alabama is one of the states. Alabama, Indiana. No, Illinois is too liberal.
What?
You already said Florida, and that's not one. Georgia's one of them. Arkansas, South Carolina, and the last one is Wyoming. I know. So they tried to charge these guys with hate crimes. They charged them with murder. They tried to charge them with hate crimes, but they don't have an anti-hate crime law in Wyoming. So they couldn't tack that on to their sentencing. So they just charged them with murder. And because he died 2 days later, and because exposure was part of his problem, they charged them with second-degree murder, unfortunately. Victimization of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender students. 65% of the students indicated that they have been harassed during the last year. 65%. 39% reported harassment due to their appearance, and 33% said that they were harassed because of their actual or perceived sexual orientation. And of course, this is a hate crime as well. Sexual orientation. It hasn't been very long that the United States did not recognize gay marriage. It's only been a couple of years. Before that, it was a political issue. And it was a political issue that was thrown up by conservatives for decades. Ooh, we have to fight, we have to keep gay marriage from ever being legalized. We can't allow that to happen. States actually passed laws that said that a marriage could only be between a man and a woman. They actually passed those laws in select states. It didn't make any difference because the Supreme Court, of course, said that gay marriage was legalized, was legal. Actually, what happened was the military said that they would recognize gay marriage. And if the federal government, if the military recognizes it, then the federal government had to determine whether it was constitutional. They determined it was constitutional, so now all of those laws that say marriage is only between a man, it can only be between a man and a woman, they had to throw those laws out. So the states had to do away with them. That's the way it works. The federal government said that because if a military couple that is gay goes into a state that does not allow gay marriage, who wins? The federal government or the state? That's the question. And of course the federal government wins. They're number one. They're number one. LGBT students were 3 times as likely to report feeling unsafe in school, 22% to 7% of non-LGBT students, and 1.5 times as likely to have been harassed. 90% versus 62% of people that were harassed. More teachers, 53% than students. 36% reported that they considered bullying or harassment to be a serious problem at their school. One of the reasons that they hired my daughter in Clinton, Iowa is because they have been having problems with violence and with bullying at the school. So they brought up somebody from Florida who sees it every day in order to try to control it in Iowa. My daughter is 4'11". She weighs, if she weighs 100 pounds, then she's put on weight since the last time I saw her. She's a tiny little thing, but she's mean as a snake. She doesn't put up with anything. I don't know where she got that. It's certainly not from me, because I put up with everything. I know. I let you guys turn in your crap whenever you want to. Oh. I could be mean. I just don't have it in me, I guess. Megan Meyer was a fragile teen. She was suffering from depression and ADHD and obsessing about her weight. She felt like she was overweight. After supposedly dissing her friend, the friend and her mother retaliated by creating a fake MySpace account of a boy and flirting with Meyer. So she thought, ooh, yeah, this positive things are going to happen. One fateful day, the ersatz boyfriend ranted about how Megan was not a good friend and that the world would be better off if you weren't in it. That's what they said. That's what they said, because it was the daughter and the mother that were actually the boyfriend. Megan promptly went into her room and hung herself with a belt in her closet. She was only 13 years old. I know, Megan Meyer, the famous Megan Meyer. Why is she famous? Because this is the first case of internet bullying that they prosecuted. And they prosecuted the mother. And the mother's in jail. I think she's in jail. I think she's in jail. I hope she's in jail. She needs to be in jail. Technological advancements have brought new forms of victimization. Identity theft, in which information about an individual's personal and financial life is stolen by computer hackers and being used fraudulently. That's called catfishing. Is that what it's called? Is that what it's called when you pretend you make a fake identity and harass people, or not harass, but seduce, I guess. I don't know what you're doing on the internet. I don't know what you guys are doing on the internet. None of this makes any sense. I don't even look at Facebook anymore. Cyber stalking is a technique favored by some sexual predators as a way to target victims. Cyberbullying can occur through blogs, Facebook, and other social networking sites. We know about trolling, where you would just attack somebody on the internet. You know, I used to read, I'd read a story and then I'd go down and I'd read what the comments people had made. I don't do that anymore. because they're so god-awful. My goodness gracious. I know what those words mean, and I put them together myself in my head, but I certainly would never say that to anybody, even on the internet. It seems like they could be sued for referring to somebody's penis that way. I mean, that's just not right. And horrible stuff. I mean, just horrible stuff. It's a story. Why in the world are you being so ugly about all this stuff? Trolling, that's called trolling. Catfishing is where you make up your own identity. So you can be a boy or a girl, you can be 25, you can be 75, whatever. In addition to cyberbullying, psychologists have identified 4 other subtypes of bullying: physical bullying, verbal bullying, social exclusion, shunning, spreading rumors about people, which seems a little odd. Males were more likely to be victims of all kinds of bullying because men are meaner than women are. Or are they? Megan Meyer was not harassed by 2 guys, she was harassed by a daughter and a mother because she had dissed them. I know. She had said something bad about the daughter, so they decided that they would kill her. Of course, isn't that what you do next, is kill somebody? I guess, yes or no. Bullying, anyway, this is, we're talking about victims here. So most of this chapter is about bullying, some of it's about sexual harassment. It's really a fascinating chapter. And we'll pick this up next week when we come back together on Monday, which is what day? I don't know. Is that 8th? 9th. 9th, okay. I'll see you on the 9th then.
But it's Columbus Day.
You guys celebrate Columbus Day? You don't celebrate Columbus.
Now we do.
We celebrate for you.
I have never been any place that they didn't celebrate Columbus Day until I went to the other reservation.